that this talk today will help us to think through, as a school, as a faculty, as students, what would be the guidelines around conflicts of interest between the research, service, policy, advocacy things we do, and fulfilling our ethical and professional mission. So I'm going to turn it over. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, I'm going to use this thing. Right. Okay, let's try the microphone. Is this going to work? The microphone's going to work? Great, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and letting me do this. I'm going to be talking about what is very much a work in progress, and I'm really interested to hear your reactions to it. So let me just plunge right in by saying that this is a really hot topic these days. That JAMA, one of the premier medical journals in this country, had an entire issue devoted to conflict of interest. It came out in May, and it defined conflict on its cover, which has this sort of dollar bill-looking thing. It says within that, a conflict of interest happens when a professional judgment is influenced by some outside factor, usually money. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking specifically about nutrition research because that's the field that I'm in, but I think you'll see that it's applicable to other kinds of public health research. What I'm going to be talking about is very much a work in progress. I am currently doing the final revisions on a manuscript on a book that has a working title, Nutrition for Sale, with a question mark after it. I can guarantee you that that's not going to be the final title because the publisher hates it. And they want feeding frenzy. I don't think so. So we're going to try to resolve that. The book is being published by Bates under contract to Basic Books, and it's scheduled for publication on October 30th, the day before Halloween. Is this a joke? I don't know, 2018. What it covers is what's listed here. I'm talking about the influence of industry funding on research, advisory committees, and societies that have to do with nutrition. I discuss the debates over issues connected with food industry funding, because I can promise you, not everybody agrees with what I'm about to say. And I'll talk a little bit about the solutions, although I have a question mark after the solutions, because I'm not sure there's a very easy way to resolve the issues that arise other than just simply not taking the money. So I want to start by talking about how difficult this is to talk about and to acknowledge what a painfully unpleasant topic this is. It is embarrassing to talk about your own relationships with food companies. I certainly find it that way. I have a policy, but it's not a perfect policy. I find it really hard to get articles about this topic published, and I'm part of the story which complicates it even more. This is my current, or actually it's my most recent conflict of interest disclosure statement. I don't take money directly from food companies, but I do earn money for lectures like this one and books that I write about these topics. So that gives me an intellectual interest in the topic. My personal conflict of interest policy, developed after many years, is to accept reimbursements from food companies, food, beverage, and supplement companies. I lump them together as food companies, and investment companies. I will accept my reimbursement for travel, hotels, meals, meeting registrations, and I pick up swag at meetings. All of these have been shown to exert influence on physicians' prescription practices, and I'm very well aware of that. I do not take honoraria or other payments from food, beverage, supplement companies or investment companies that invest in them. But on the other hand, they're rich and I'm not. So I have them give that money, instead of giving it to me personally, to either the Food Studies collection at NYU's library, or now that I'm retired, to a student scholarship fund in my department, from which I gain reputational benefit, and any ethicist would tell you that this crosses a line. I did this because I'm an academic, and if I'm invited to a meeting in Europe, I don't want to pay for it myself. I won't go if I have to pay for it myself. It's way too expensive. So I feel like I have to do that, and I'm so squirmy about this that it sort of makes me think about these things all the time. The issues, of course, are whether what I'm accepting exerts unconscious influence on what I do, and it also raises questions about whether I'm being used, and I'll talk about all of these things. Let me give you a couple of examples of some of the recent things that made me squirm. In February this year, Daniel Lubetzky, who's the CEO of Kind Bars, concerned about some of the articles about conflicts of interest that were appearing in the press, decided that he was going to give $25 million over a 10-year period to form an organization called Feed the Truth that would do investigations of corporate involvement in public health matters. And he asked me to be on the committee that would appoint a board of directors for this new organization. And I agreed to do that, along with Michael Jacobson of Center for Science and the Public Interest, and Deb Eschmeyer, who used to be Michelle Obama's head of Let's Move. Uh-oh, what's that? I don't know what that is. An article about the Kind Bar Feed the Truth organization was written about in the Washington Post. And the Washington Post story said, the irony wasn't lost on me. I was persuaded by Lubetzky. I was. He's fantastic. And I wasn't being paid, although the organization covered my travel expenses. I did not like having the fact that my travel expenses were covered by Kind Bar in the Washington Post. I would just as soon not have had that be something that was public. I found it embarrassing. Let's try another one. At the end of September, I agreed to and did give a lecture. I gave the keynote lecture at a international nutrition symposium run by Nestle, to which I'm not related. They were very amused. So I agreed to give this talk, and I did give it. But the talk turned out to be the week after the New York Times ran this article about how Nestle, among other companies, have been aggressively marketing their junk foods in developing countries. This was an enormous article in the New York Times, the first of the, what do they call them, Planet Fat articles that they're doing. And here I was at a company that's doing things of which I totally disapprove. And here I am speaking at a symposium at it. And boy, did I hear from people. Nestle is a company that has an ancient history dating back to the 1970s of inappropriate marketing of breast milk substitutes, infant formula in developing countries, and they're still doing that. They're trying to market food products to young children. And the nutrition advocacy community, I got emails while I was in Switzerland from at least 7 or 8 different people from all over the world saying how disappointed they were in my being at this Nestle meeting. They totally disagree with my decision to be there. They think I was sending confusing signals. This is going to ruin my reputation forever. And they thought I should withdraw, and that withdrawing would send a powerful signal to Nestle about its marketing practices. And there I was, giving a talk at the Nestle Symposium. Very, very difficult situation. I also get lots of articles rejected. If you write about conflicts of interest, journals don't want to, and you name names. If you are talking about a company or if you're talking about individuals in your article, the journals simply do not want to publish it. I'm a peer reviewer for an astonishing number of journals, and I can tell you, and I get sent practically every article on conflicts of interest in nutrition that anybody is writing, and I could tell you that I see the same article sometimes 3 or 4 times from one journal after another, because they too are having trouble getting their stuff published. So this is a tough field to be working in, and I'm only able to do it because I had tenure and I'm now retired. So let me tell you why I'm doing this book. The genesis of this book came in August 2015 when my most recent book, Soda Politics, was at the printer, scheduled for publication October 1st that year. Now, Soda Politics had been a 3-year headache. I was threatened with a lawsuit. There were a lot of legal problems with the publisher. It was a big headache all the way through, and I had pretty much decided that Soda Politics was my last book. That was enough of that. And then the New York Times came out with an article in August 2015, in which this was one of these enormous articles that went into the inside pages on Coca-Cola's funding of a group called the Global Energy Balance Network, which were a group of professors at various universities who had formed this network to argue that you didn't have to worry about what you ate or drank. If you were worried about obesity, all you had to do was be a little bit more active, something that the data absolutely contradict. This article was so shocking that even Fox News was shocked, as you see here. Well, I was quoted in the article, and the quote ran across the top of the inside pages, and I got called by a lot of reporters in the week after the article came out. The reporters told me that they were shocked. They just couldn't believe that Coca-Cola would fund research that was so obviously self-serving, that scientists would take Coca-Cola money for doing this kind of research, or that universities would let them get away with it. It was obvious that these reporters knew nothing about how universities work these days, and nothing about any of it. And I thought, well, if these reporters don't know any of this, I certainly did, because I've just written about it in this book. Another book was clearly needed to bring these issues to public attention. And I was not exactly unprepared for taking on this topic. I wrote my first article about conflicts of interest in nutrition research. Hello, I've got it here. It's back, okay. I wrote my first article in 2001 for Public Health Nutrition. I took that article and incorporated it into a chapter in Food Politics. I wrote about the soda industry's conflicts in Soda Politics, and I've been writing occasional invited commentaries about it a couple of times for JAMA Internal Medicine, which commissions articles on these things every now and then. So I had a fairly good publication basis for thinking about it, and also by coincidence, in March 2015, I started what turned out to be a year-long exercise in which every time I found 5 studies that were funded by food companies, I would post them on my blog. And at the end of the year, I had accumulated 168 studies, of which 156 had results that were favorable to the sponsor's interest, and only 12 were unfavorable. Now, this was a convenient sample. I just collected articles in journals that I happened to read or that were sent to me by colleagues. I didn't approach this in any systematic way. So the only conclusion that you can draw from this really is that it's easier to find industry-funded studies that come out with results favorable to the sponsor than it is to find industry-funded studies that are unfavorable. That's the only conclusion that you can come to. Nevertheless, my little collection had some useful information in it. For one thing, it enabled me to describe the universe of companies that are funding research. And the makers and producers of every one of these products, and a whole lot more that I haven't listed here, were involved in the studies that I posted in that collection of 168, and I've listed some of the companies that were funding that kind of research. But in addition to Coca-Cola and Nestle and Mars and Walt Disney, of all things. There were also the producers of nuts and olive oil and pomegranates and chocolate and everything else that you can think of. And in the book, I wrote chapters on food industry funding of studies on sweets, on meat and dairy, on healthy foods, and on Coca-Cola. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of those. Let me give you an example of one of the sweet studies. I'm going to just give you two examples that I just particularly love. This one, the Associated Press wrote about how candy makers shape nutrition science, and they talked about a study that showed that kids who eat candy have lower body weights than kids that don't, and also lower risk for cardiovascular disease and better diet quality. Oh, come on. Who paid for the study? The National Confectioners Association, in partnership with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Or here's one of my all-time favorites, dietary flavonoid intake and incidence of erectile dysfunction. Blueberries, said the press release, are associated with reduced risk of erectile dysfunction. Aren't you glad to know that? And the authors of this study were funded by the U.S. Blueberry Highbush Council for a separate project, not this one, but they had a tie to an industry that would profit from marketing blueberries as having this magnificent benefit. Try it and see if it works. So the conclusion of this kind of thing is that industry-funded research, just at a glance, your obvious sort of response to something like this is that these companies are doing this for marketing purposes. There is no reason at all why anybody would do a study on blueberries and erectile dysfunction if they couldn't advertise blueberries at the end of it. I mean, diets are never about just one food. Diets are always about everything that you eat and your lifestyle and your genetics and everything else about you. So these single food things make no sense. But what the industries are doing is exactly what the tobacco industry did in order to encourage people to think that cigarettes weren't really associated with lung cancer. And the tobacco industry gets credit for inventing what is referred to as the Playbook. And the Playbook is a sort of list of instructions for corporations that are making products of dubious health benefit. Blueberries are fine. But products of dubious health benefit in particular, they fund friendly science. So they get the answers they want. They attack independent science and scientists. They make partnerships and give gifts and payments to scientists. They create front groups. They blame personal responsibility. It's your fault if you're sick. They insist on self-regulation, and they lobby like mad to make sure that no government agency tries to regulate them. Now, there is on this topic, and I can't believe I'm summarizing this in one slide, because what I am summarizing here is 50 years of research on the effect of funding by tobacco, chemical, and pharmaceutical company interests, mainly on physicians' prescription practices and on the outcome of research. The amount of research on this topic is overwhelming. Somebody did a quick search and found 8,000 items, but I think it has to be more than that. There are many, many books on conflicts of interest in medical research and practice, and this research taken together shows repeatedly and compellingly that sponsored research almost invariably favors the sponsor's interest, that gifts have influence, and no surprise, bigger gifts have more influence than smaller gifts, but the influence is generally unconscious. People are completely unaware of being influenced. They didn't intend to be influenced. They don't recognize the influence, and they deny it. And this has been shown over and over and over again. The justifications for taking industry money are very similar across all those industries, And the solution to it, disclosure, admitting that you've got ties to these companies, is necessary, but it's insufficient to prevent conflicts of interest, and more complicated prevention and management strategies are essential. As I said, the book in the upper right-hand corner is from what was then the Institute of Medicine, and it's probably the Bible of studies of conflict of interest on doctors' prescription practices and on research. And what's astounding about this, and I want to use the drug industry as an example, because the research goes back so far. The first book that I can find on it was done by faculty members then at UCSF in 1974. There was another one 20 years later. And now, because there were 50 years of concern about how drug companies were buying physicians' prescription practices, when the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, it included what is called the Physician Sunshine Act, which requires drug companies to post publicly how much money they give to physicians and who the physicians are. And you can go on this website and see at a glance that nearly 1,500 drug companies gave $8 billion, half of it for research, to more than 600,000 doctors at 1,100 teaching hospitals. They keep count. And you can, because you have these data, you can do studies. And you can do studies to show that the effects on prescription practices, on advisory committee decisions, on the outcome of research, all of that is measurable. All of that is measurable. And then the decline in public trust, which is less easy to measure, but has been measured. So there's a huge database on this. Okay, what about food and nutrition? Well, we know from a study published in JAMA Internal Medicine last year that the sugar industry was involved in manipulating research, or trying to manipulate research, to demonstrate that fat was a more important factor in coronary heart disease than sugar. And I know about this study because I wrote the editorial that went with it, but we didn't find out about it until 2016. And this article caused a sensation. It won the prize for the largest number of downloads from JAMA Internal Medicine. I think there were 450,000 downloads, which is pretty impressive. My editorial had many fewer. The first article I can find about concern about conflicts of interest in nutrition research was in, of all things, the Congressional Record. Michael Jacobson, who just stepped down as head of the Center for Science and the Public Interest, got a congressman, Benjamin Rosenthal, to work with him on an article that was posted in the Congressional Record, in which they called Feeding at the Company Trough, in which they listed a whole series of very prominent nutrition researchers who were involved in advisory committees on nutrition and health, and listed all of the conflicts of all of the food and drug companies that they had consulting agreements with, worked for, or had payments from in one way or another. That was 1976. As far as I can tell, nothing else happened between 1976 and 2001 when I wrote that article. But then in 2003, Center for Science and the Public Interest started an Integrity in Science project, and that lasted until 2009 when they ran out of money and stopped doing it. But in the interim, they listed about 2,000 researchers, not just food and nutrition researchers, but researchers in all areas, connections to industry ties, and there are still vestiges of that database on the website. And one other thing, the New England Journal of Medicine, which had an editor who was really upset about what drug companies were doing, in 1984 started a policy in the New England Journal of Medicine of requiring authors to disclose who paid for their studies and whether they had any kind of other financial ties to companies that had a vested interest in the drug under consideration. That was the first journal to do that. Nutrition journals lagged in starting to do that, but by 1990, the Journal of Nutrition started doing it. The Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics in 1992. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition not until 2003. And they did that because by that time, all of the medical journals were requiring conflict of interest statements, which make it possible to tell whether the authors of studies had these kinds of financial ties if they disclosed them, and they don't always do that. So there's this avalanche and library of studies on drug industry funding. What about studies of food industry funding? I have been able to find 10. 2 hands, 10. The first one in 2003 and the most recent ones in 2016. These vary in the kinds of studies that they did. They varied in the product that was being examined. Half of them are sugar-sweetened beverages. They varied in the health outcome they were looking at. They varied in methods. Some of them were descriptive, some of them were systematic. And they varied in outcome, although most of them favored the sponsor's interest. So these were meta-analyses of meta-analyses, or systematic studies looking at studies that were looking at the relationship of nutrition to health. And they came out with several conclusions that seemed pretty consistent, but not nearly as strong as the drug industry research. They favored the sponsor's interest, although there were exceptions, and it looked like they were skewing the research questions to give that was the place where the biases really showed, or in the interpretation of results where they were spinning the results positively. Now, Lisa Biro, who is somebody who studies conflicts of interest in research and is now at the University of Sydney, did a systematic review of the studies she could find on outcome of nutrition research, and did a systematic review and meta-analysis. She found 12 studies, and she had some different ones than I did because she wasn't looking exclusively at studies of foods and health. Her conclusion was that although these studies were more likely to favor the sponsor's interest, the result was not statistically significant. So it was a very, very weak association. But she was she included in her 12 studies, studies that were funded by the food industry. And here's one. And the studies that were funded by the food industry, this one happened to be funded by the International Life Sciences Institute, which is an organization that positions itself as an independent think tank on science issues, but is actually almost totally funded by the food industry. It's got 400 food companies that contribute to it, and it's basically a front group. And it looked at the relationship of food industry funding to the quality of the research in the studies, and the conclusion here was that the quality of the studies could not be predicted from the funding source. Well, I'm not aware of any research that indicates that the quality of food industry funded studies is different from the quality of studies funded by other kinds of organizations. But I'm very well aware that the research shows that it's not the quality, it's the research question and the interpretation where the biases really come. This is Lisa Biro. She wrote about this in November and has a really interesting article about how food companies can sneak bias into scientific research. And she talks about in that article how you can set up a study to give you the answer that you want, consciously or unconsciously. When food industry influence is involved, it could be unconscious. You don't know. Let me give another example that has slightly more of a impact than the ones I showed you before. Here's a meta-analysis of egg consumption and the risk of coronary heart disease and stroke that was funded by the Egg Nutrition Center, which is the main lobbying or the main education arm of the checkoff program for eggs run by the Department of Agriculture. This article is one of the ones that caused the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, a group in Washington that's very interested in vegan diets and animal welfare, to sue the Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services over the 2015 dietary guidelines for Americans, because the 2015 dietary guidelines for Americans dropped the cholesterol recommendation. Eggs are the main source of cholesterol in American diets, and one egg contains about 200 milligrams of cholesterol. If you want to lower your dietary cholesterol, you have to stop eating eggs or not eat as many. And the lawsuit accused the departments for having been influenced by the Egg Nutrition Center, which dominates research on cholesterol and heart disease. Nobody else is doing that kind of research, and has exerted undue influence on the dietary guidelines. And they noted that in 1992, only 29% of the studies in a major review were paid for by the egg industry, but as the years went on, the percentage of studies paid for by the egg industry got larger and larger. Also, the suit noted that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which writes the research report that's the basis of the dietary guidelines, the co-chair and 4 other members of that committee had financial ties to the egg industry of one kind or another. Now, the suit was thrown out of court on amazing grounds. The judge said there's no legal definition of inappropriate influence, so there's no basis for the suit. The suit was charging inappropriate influence. We don't know what inappropriate influence is. Out you go. That was the end of it. But when the dietary guidelines came out at the beginning of 2016, they specified that they were not making the recommendation for cholesterol to eat no more than 300 milligrams a day of cholesterol that had been in the dietary guidelines since 1980. They dropped the guideline that had been in the guidelines since 1980, but then they said individuals should eat as little dietary cholesterol as possible. Could you explain that to me? I just don't understand that at all. On the one hand, they're dropping a recommendation to eat less than 300 milligrams a day. On the other hand, they're saying eat as little as possible. I don't get it. I don't know how bad dietary cholesterol is. I can't tell. The research is so tainted, it's impossible to make any sense of it. There was one other fallout from the dietary guidelines, and this one didn't have to do with eggs. This one had to do with meat. A pro-meat lobbying group went to Congress and got Congress to appropriate $1 million to the National Academy of Medicine to do a study on the dietary guidelines process to deal with the conflicts of interest of members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. That report came out in February, I think, or the first report came out in February. There was a second report also. And the committee recommended that advisory committee members be nominated by a third party, that the list be posted for public comment, and that there be a completely transparent conflict of interest policy all the way through. And I really laughed when I looked to see what the conflicts of interest were on the committee that wrote this report, and they weren't listed. In the second report, they are listed. And the dietary guidelines, there's a webinar or a telephone call on Friday where the Department of Agriculture is holding a telephone listening session to explain how they're going to approach the dietary guidelines for 2020, which are running late. Okay, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to have a chapter on Coca-Cola. I just wrote a book about the soda industry. Why more about Coca-Cola? Well, the answer to that is because Coca-Cola made things measurable. They laid out what they were doing in terms of funding research so that researchers could come in and do some analysis. That came about as the result of the New York Times article. The head of Coca-Cola said, we're going to go transparent. They did go transparent, and you can go on the Coca-Cola Transparency website and see everybody they're funding these days by name and organization. So Coca-Cola, when you know who they're funding, you can look at the research, and Coca-Cola has historically funded research that shows that the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is the main source of information about diet and health, has no validity. The methods are so bad it's not valid. That anybody who thinks that sugary beverages have anything to do with obesity, that's overstated, and that sugars are harmless to health. So they've had study after study after study showing that, and they spent $138 million on that kind of research between 2010 and 2016. So that's measurable. This group of investigators looked at studies that tried to relate sugary drinks to obesity and type 2 diabetes. They found 26 studies that said there was no relationship at all between sugary drinks and obesity and type 2 diabetes. Every single one of them was funded by the soda industry or the sugar industry or something like that. They found 34 studies that said, yes, there's a relationship. Only one was funded by industry. So that's that trend again. Oh, and here's where things get really weird. I mean, things get really weird. I mean, this is why I'm talking about Coca-Cola. Remember the hacked emails? You may have read about them in the newspaper, where the Russians were interfering with the U.S. election. Well, it turns out they posted emails from the Democratic National Committee on WikiLeaks' website, but they also posted another set of emails on the DC Links website, and these emails included a Clinton insider named Capricia Marshall. The Capricia Marshall emails were especially interesting because they included a set of email conversations between Ms. Marshall, who was an advisor to Hillary Clinton, and a vice president of Coca-Cola. And the reason those emails were there, because while she was working on the Clinton campaign, she was billing Coca-Cola $7,000 a month for consulting services, and we know this because the emails say so. So the emails, they're fabulous. I mean, they're just amazing. A group called Ninjas for Health did an analysis and showed that Coca-Cola had a worldwide political strategy to kill soda taxes. You can read what the Coca-Cola executives said about these things. The emails show that Coca-Cola was absolutely explicitly involved in setting the research agenda for the kinds of research I just showed you, for crafting the press releases, for organizing the investigators' presentations. They viewed the researchers who were doing the research as team members. They called them, hey, team. They were putting pressure on reporters, and they were spying on critics. And the spying on critics I take very personally. Maybe you read in the New York Times some months ago that restricted spyware was used to hack the Advocates of Mexico soda tax. This is Simon Barquera, who was one of the researchers on the Mexican soda taxes. He had this put in his spyware, and when I was in Mexico in February working at the Public Health Institute where he works, whenever I talked to him, we had to put our phones in the refrigerator so nobody would listen to them. If you saw yesterday's New York Times, you saw the article about Colombia and people who are working on soda tax initiatives in Colombia. Am I losing this again? No, he's coming back. Hello, come back. Good, thank you. And so they've been spying, but I got spied on. The DC Links emails had a whole set of emails about a talk I had given at a nutrition society meeting in in Sydney. At the time, I was working at the University of Sydney in Lisa Biro's group. I was visiting professor. And somebody came and took notes in my lecture. I didn't think anything of it because I just written soda politics, and I assumed that somebody from the soda industry is at every lecture I give. You know who you are. Well, so these emails show that whoever this person was, who took terrific notes on my lecture, very impressive, and then recommended that CocaCola monitor what I do in Australia and also monitor Lisa Biro. And that was so exciting to the University of Sydney that the Sydney Morning Herald did a big article about how they were, the cola industry was tracking her. So Coca-Cola is fun to write about. So one question I had was how much nutrition research is industry funded? And it turns out somebody tried to answer that question, although his work has never been published. He looked at 15 leading nutrition journals. You wouldn't believe there were that many, but there are, national and international, in 2014, and identified 4,000 peer-reviewed articles in those journals, and counted up the number that were funded by industry or whose investigators were funded by industry, and it was only 14%. And that seems about right to me in looking through the various journals that I read. Of that 14%, 60% had results favorable to the sponsor, 3% had results unfavorable, and the rest didn't have anything to do with the sponsor's interest. So that's more evidence for the same kind of phenomenon. Let me say a word now about the nutrition societies, because nutrition societies sort of set the tone for the profession and set standards for the profession in lots of ways. In 2013, a lawyer in San Francisco, Michelle Simon, who now works for a company that is interested in plant-based foods. I think it's called the Plant-Based Food Association. In 2013, she was hired to do an investigative report on food industry funding of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, an organization that I don't belong to, but it's got 100,000 members and a lot of money every year. There was concern in the organization because the organization was selling its logo, in this case, its Kids Eat Right logo, to products that met certain nutritional criteria, and the first product to qualify was Kraft Singles. This caused Jon Stewart to do a video clip in which he made the comment that the Academy of Dietetics is an academy in the same way this is cheese. This isn't really cheese, this is a cheese product. So that's very embarrassing for the Dietetic Association. Also embarrassing, a couple of years later, was an article in the Associated Press did at the end of 2016, where Candace Choi, who was writing for the Associated Press at the time, went to the big conference that the Dietetic Association had and wrote an article called Do Candy and Soda Makers Belong at a Dietitian's Conference? And she tweeted the most amazing thing, which was the Sugar Association's tips for getting kids to eat their vegetables. Put sugar on them. Should dietitians be doing this? It's very embarrassing. Within the Dietetic Society is a rogue organization, very much within the organization, run by Andy Bellotti, one of a graduate of our program that I'm very proud of. And he formed this organization specifically to try to get the Dietetic Association to start looking more seriously at its relationships with food companies and to have more financial transparency and to try to set some ethical standards about what they would and would not take money from. And he's making inroads, slowly, but he is making inroads. On the other hand, the organization that I do belong to, the American Society for Nutrition, Michelle Simon did a report on them too in 2015. It's a much, much smaller group, but it too has relationships with food companies that look embarrassing from the outside. Here's a satellite symposium and its annual meeting on beverages and health, sponsored by PepsiCo. And the organization gets between $15,000 and $50,000 for these sponsored sessions at the annual meeting. And those sponsored sessions are integrated into the annual meeting. You can't tell which ones are, I mean, they're labeled, but you have to look for the labels to see which ones are sponsored and which ones are not. The American Society for Nutrition publishes 4 journals. And if you look at the editorial boards of the 3 journals that are in print, the majority of editors of those journals declare food industry conflicts of interest. This is one from David Allison, who happens to come first in the alphabet, but he gives a great big long list of consults and food, beverage, and supplement organizations and companies that he consults for. So if you're writing about conflicts of interest and you're submitting your paper to one of these journals, you can't expect the editorial staff to take a very sympathetic view. And I have a paper currently under review in the Advances of Nutrition. It's been under review since June, and I still don't have a decision on it. And the editor who is dealing with it is a trustee of ILSI. The American Society for Nutrition comes out with position statements that the membership has not voted on. They oppose labeling of added sugars, saying that it's not sugar, it's calories. They think that processed foods are nutritionally important in American diets. And because of the fuss about some of these things, the Society has appointed what they call a blue ribbon committee on ensuring trust in nutrition science that presumably is going to deal with setting up policies that will protect the organization from embarrassing situations like that. But that committee is having a very, very difficult time coming to decisions, and it's been almost 2 years now, and they haven't come up with anything yet. And the Society is still making arguments that show that it doesn't think its conflicts of interest are very serious. So what if the sugar industry funds research? Science is science. So that brings me to the debates. So what if the sugar industry funds research? It's the science that counts. There is a huge debate in the literature. There are articles that say that partnerships between health organizations and the food industry are going to derail public health nutrition. On the other hand, there are articles that say that public-private partnerships are the future of nutrition research, and the BMJ, which publishes a lot of these things, actually had a debate where Derek Yak was on the side saying, yes, the food industry should fund nutrition research, and Simon Capewell was on the side that said no. So these debates are going on. The rationale for accepting food industry money is that they need the money, basically. Government funding is scarce. Journals tend not to publish negative results, and universities are asking faculty to have partnerships with industry. I have lots and lots of letters that have been sent to me by universities. When I was at the University of Sydney, the vice chancellor sent around a letter saying, we really want you to explore partnerships with industry. And industry is funding more research. This is a graph that was given to me by Marie Bragg, one of my NYU colleagues, and Jessica Osterman, a student who works with her, where they did a big study that hasn't been published yet to try to find out what companies are funding research and how much they're spending. And you can see from this that between 2000 and 2016, the amount of money that food companies are investing in research is going up quite dramatically. There are other rationales as well, and I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about these, because these, I think, are in a way more serious. David Allison, the editor who's conflicts of interest I showed you was a co-author of a paper called Whitehead Bias, which and by that he means public health people who think they're doing good have a bias in the kinds of studies that they do because they want to prove that sugar-sweetened beverages are bad for health. That's their bias. And people who are making these kinds of arguments generally argue that industry funding has no influence on them, that any criticism of their taking industry funding is an ad hominem attack, a witch hunt, that career goals, scientific beliefs, and ideology are just as biasing, and that disclosure takes care of any conflicts and leave me alone. So those are, I think, the major arguments. And an ethicist who's now at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, Daniel Goldberg, told me that he was so tired of hearing the same old tired excuses for taking industry funding that he turned it into a game, which he called COI Bingo. This is published in the BMJ. There's an article in the BMJ that has this, and the squares have things like, scientists control the work, we're in charge, this isn't corrupt, science speaks for itself, this doesn't affect me, disclosure is enough, and so forth. I mean, he just thinks the whole thing is really tiresome because the people who make these kinds of arguments are unaware of the library of studies that have come out on drug industry funding of physicians, which, 50 years and a whole library of studies. But there are other people who kind of agree too. John, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but ADIZ, who studies research at Stanford University, published a paper called Implausible Results in Human Nutrition Research. He thinks that nutrition research is just really hopeless. I think it's difficult, not hopeless. And he said, a quotation from that, given that fanatical opinions abound in nutrition, allegiance bias should also be minimized. Well, I think there's a big difference between allegiance bias and industry fund and biases due to industry funding. And that comes from the fact that all nutrition science has scientists who have biases. That's what a hypothesis is. A hypothesis is a bias stated in advance. And if you're a scientist, you're testing that hypothesis. The purpose of nutrition science is to advance knowledge and promote public health. The biases are intrinsic to the scientific process. Everybody has them. And the biases vary. People who really think that meat is the best thing you should eat have that kind of bias. People who think you should eat nothing but plants have a different bias. Those biases conflict with each other and may even cancel each other out. But industry-funded nutrition science is really different. Its purpose is to promote new products or marketing, or to cast doubt on science that it doesn't like. Industry funding is optional. It's not intrinsic to the process. And as we've seen over and over again, the biases favor industry. They lean in one direction. So I think there's a difference. And that's why industry funding is so problematic. It raises a bunch of risks. It raises scientific risks, that it skews the research agenda, the results, and the interpretations. It distorts advice given by nutrition professionals, and it induces a great deal of loss of trust in nutritionists, and nutrition science. That's not good. It also carries some personal risks, or what are called opportunity costs, as federal committees are cracking down on conflicts of interest, and I'm expecting, even in this administration, that there will be more crackdowns. If you're taking industry, exposure in the press is enormously embarrassing. Say, and you appear sold out. Not nice. You want to think twice about that, and maybe more than twice. So the issues, it seems to me, in managing conflict of interest are that the biases are, I'm going to give everybody benefit of the doubt and say that the biases are unconscious and unrecognized. That makes them really difficult to manage. If you don't know that you're being influenced, it's pretty hard to do something about it, or it's pretty hard to be motivated to do something about it. I haven't talked about disclosure, which is a whole chapter in itself, but trust me, it's incomplete. People don't like disclosing these things. And there's also research that shows that disclosure has perverse effects, and it makes people trust the research even more because they think the researcher is being honest. Mitigation of conflicts of interest is very difficult. Every university has to have policies about this if they get federal grants, because the federal granting agencies require enormously strict conflicts of interest disclosures, and they visit the universities and do site visits to make sure that those rules are being followed. And compliance with the whole thing is very weak. Everybody would rather not deal with this. It's just too embarrassing and difficult. The World Health Organization has tried to take this on in its engagement with non-state actors and addressing and managing conflicts of interest within the organization, and then also for its member states, trying to figure out ways that they can manage nutrition conflicts of interest in nutrition programs throughout the world. These are highly argued about. The fact that they're doing it is terrific. There are lots of holes in them, and it's very hard for the World Health Organization to have any effect on whether countries actually follow these guidelines or not. In the United States, most of the effort to try to find frameworks for dealing with conflicts of interest comes from ILSI. ILSI has a vested interest in trying to make sure that industry funding of nutrition research takes place, and that nobody criticizes it too heavily. So since 2009, they have had at least 4 major consultations and efforts and committees coming together to develop frameworks for dealing with conflicts of interest, and you can take a look at them. They're pretty easy to find. They look good on paper. If you look at them really closely, they leave lots of loopholes. So one solution to this problem that comes, well, the obvious solution to this problem is more federal funding for research. Good luck with that. Federal funding for research has gone down in proportion to industry funding research. That's across the board, not just in nutrition. So short of that, the one suggestion that comes up over and over and over again is pooling industry funds into one common pool, having some kind of third party distribute the funds just like NIH does. And this would separate the investigator from any one company. And it sounds like a really good idea in theory. In practice, it hasn't worked very well. There have been several attempts to try historically, and it hasn't worked very well for 2 reasons. Food companies are reluctant to put money into a pool where they don't control the kind of research that's going to take place. They just don't want to do it. And if you do have companies donating to a pool and you're the administrator of that pool, you want to keep those donors happy. You have a vested interest in making sure that those donors keep donating. So the only way that I can think of that something like this would work would be if there was a mandatory tax on all food companies that make over a certain amount of money or sell over a certain amount of food, and that they would have to do that, and then that would take away any concern about whether they would keep donating. But the problem is there's no legal way to do that, is what I've been told. Absolutely no legal way to do it, and I suspect the companies would fight it very, very hard in the same way they're fighting soda taxes. So what is to be done in the interim? I don't know. I just hope you'll recognize this as a problem. I have very low expectations for what can be done at this point. But recognizing the problem and recognizing that it is a problem would be a big step in the right direction. And then have a policy. Even if your policy isn't perfect, even if your policy has loopholes, just the fact that you have a policy is going to make you think about it when you're engaging with food companies. You must fully disclose, and of course, just say no is always an option. You can find some other way to fund it, do it. I would be very, very interested in any other ideas that you might have. I have advice for food companies, researchers, journalists, and the public. I really want journalists to pay attention to conflicts of interest, to ask the researchers that they're talking to about who paid for their study and whether they have financial ties to companies with an interest in what they're writing about. I think journalists could do a much better job of that. And then as for the public, the question is what the public can do. And here I think you need to create some kind of mechanism for people to ask who paid for it. If a study is about a single product or a single ingredient and it has fabulous health effects, I'd be really suspicious. That's how I recognized the studies that I collected during the period that I was collecting them. The results just seemed implausible to me, and my first question was, who paid for this? I was right a lot of the time. I could predict it a lot of the time. So I think just thinking about it is an enormous improvement over the current situation. And if you're going to be thinking about it as a school here, I wish you all the luck in the world. I don't know whether the food companies are trying to shower money on you, are they? No, not a problem. Not a problem. But the food companies would be happy to fund anything that any nutritionist does, or any nutrition organization. So I'll stop here and thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. And I'm very eager to hear what you have to say about all this, if we have time. Yeah. We have time? We do. Yes.
And so this goes on all the time. And sitting and thinking about academic authority or scientific authority to influence the government opinion. First of all, EPA just put in a policy that anybody who has EPA funding cannot serve on an advisory committee. So their advisory committees are now packed.
That's an ideology. Science is an ideology these days.
Right, that's it. but it seems to me that the piece that might fix it is, was the study funded based on open application and independent peer review of the application? I think peer review of publications is just weak. Mm-hmm. But peer review of money going out is something that the scientific community cares a lot about and would influence it. So that's one of the questions, not just who funded the study, but how was the investigator chosen to do it.
Well, the CocaCola emails have a lot to say about how the investigators were chosen.
Ready for another? Yes. Maybe you can't talk about this for legal or other reasons. I studied at NYU, and part of my question is about NYU, and part of my question is about Lehman, where I teach.
I'll read.
At NYU, I know that there's a former Monsanto lawyer who's on the board of trustees, and at Lehman and our college foundation, there's a PepsiCo executive on the board. Does that influence academic integrity in terms of researching and writing about conflicts of interest? Are they willing to go to bat for you if you run into legal troubles with Coca-Cola? Or
I have never once heard from an NYU administrator expressing the slightest concern about what I do.
But do they help you if you are getting
They do, but informally. They have rules about, I should have said that, I forgot to say, because I hate talking about it, that I had a paper retracted because it was attacked by, it was a conflict of interest paper, and somebody was just furious about it, and the attacks were really rough, and there were enough errors in the paper that the journal retracted it. It was a horrible experience, but I was greatly helped by NYU's PR people to deal with it. And so I feel like they're supportive. If you get sued, I don't think the university defends faculty in lawsuits generally, but I don't really know. It's never come up, and I've never heard one word that there's a problem. They do academic freedom there, as far as I can tell. So I've just never had any trouble. So, yeah.
Hi.
I think he's got, whoever has the microphone gets to talk.
Oh, I'll
and he's the dean. He gets to talk.
I'll relinquish it anytime when my turn comes. The question, it's really not a question, but the sugary drinks experience is the daughter of the tobacco industry experience, in a way. And it does seem like the mangle of publications on sugar and health are very interesting in the sense that somehow there has been a backlash against the original science, which would be laughable in tobacco at this point. So in a sense that, just creating so much background noise and confusion, then people will say, well, I really don't know what to think anymore. And I don't think that anybody around the room today would say, I don't know if cigarettes cause lung cancer. And yet, in the media and in popular science, we are now in an unenviable situation that enough nonsense noise has been created that people, unfortunately, are not so steadfast in their convictions.
That's the playbook. I mean, that's exactly, that's rule number one, is you cast doubt. There are movies about it. It wasn't impossible to create with tobacco. It took 50 years. It took 50 years with sugar. Well, it depends on which studies who you look at. In the 1970s, there were books being written about how terrible sugar was. Nobody paid any attention to them because everybody was worried about dietary fat at the time. And that was what this JAMA Internal Medicine article was arguing, was that the sugar industry manipulated that. I don't know whether that's true or not. But I remember what the fat stuff was about, and there was a lot of evidence for fat being a risk factor for heart disease, and sugar didn't turn up as much in the studies. So I think it's very hard to disentangle the whole sugar-fat story anyway, because those arguments take place outside of their calorie context. And even if you eat more sugar than you should, if you're not overeating calories, it's just going to get burned for energy. So it's really hard to sort all that out. But I think the doubt has been, the people, there's doubt about meat, there's doubt about sugar, there's doubt about everything. In fact, nobody believes anything about nutrition anymore. I think the food industry has been very effective in using the playbook. Really good use of it. They did a good job.
Hello, Dr. Marion. It's always a pleasure to hear you. I know you were in Cuba. I always follow your blog, but I just came back from Cuba too, and it's amazing, about certain advances when they study a certain food. They're doing something with, I forgot the name, is turmeric, but they're growing that and they're producing some capsules for heart disease. But my question is, I saw a lot of people smoking, and the rum and the alcohol, the levels, is like, everybody says that, it's a dictatorship and there is a lot of things that are forbidden. Did you find out why, because I couldn't get an answer from the hospital, because everybody's allowed to smoke or have sugar. I mean, everything is like sugary, coffee, everything. And I wonder if it's because they produce it. I don't know. Did you find out anything about it?
These things are cultural phenomena. And Cuba doesn't really grow its own food. Everything is imported, pretty much. And they smoke. You go to any developing country, they smoke because the cigarette companies advertise, and they don't cost much. And rum is cheaper than milk. That's an encouragement to drink rum. That'll do it. Yes.
So about the eggs and cholesterol and the dietary guidelines, it seems like part of the argument has been lost as part of having the egg companies and the egg industry. Part of that is that the dietary cholesterol only contributes to 1/3 of the blood cholesterol, because about two thirds is from endogenous cholesterol, and that would be recycled through the intrahepatic circulation. So the notion that the only contributor to cholesterol is eating eggs, and how much the dietary cholesterol from eggs will contribute to that, it's not the only player. So that's why the dietary guidelines did not have a direct reference to the eggs as being the only source for cholesterol, primarily because of the endogenous intrahepatic circulation of cholesterol.
So then why advise eating as little cholesterol as possible?
Because, again, having this industry barging in with all this influence has contaminated a lot of research. At some point, I was doing a lot of research in guinea pigs, and we were funded by the National Institutes of Health and the American Heart Association, and we would control all aspects of the diet and having the diet isocaloric diet, and we look exactly at where from the diet that will contribute to cholesterol level. So the lack of continuation of this type of scientific research had allowed us interpretations from the egg industry and giving their version of the eggs is healthy, that diluted the actual scientific argument between the differentiation between exogenous and endogenous cholesterol.
Yeah, I would argue that the real problem with the dietary guidelines is the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Scientific Committee writes the research report, but since the George Bush II administration, the agencies write the guidelines. I don't think they know very much about nutrition. It's a problem.
This may seem tangential, and if it is, feel free to ignore it. But it seems to me that in addition to all the problems you've outlined, where industry money is influencing the findings, there's also the question of the sort of the fundamental research agenda.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, figuring that research resources are finite, and if we're going to be doing studies of blueberry impact on erectile dysfunction, my favorite takeaway from
Isn't that great? Oh, I just love it.
What would we be studying that we're not studying if industry was not pushing us into either silly and trivial studies or studies designed to undemonize their problem?
Well, we would be studying what the real issues that people are worried about, like the business about are eggs a problem, are eggs not a problem, is sugar a problem, is sugar not a problem, what about calories? About the basic metabolic issues, the kinds of things that everybody is a calorie. Is a calorie a calorie? I mean, people are really interested in those kinds of questions, and nobody is willing to pay for it. And instead, these companies are doing, and that great big long list, every single one of them is doing this. I mean, I got a letter today from the Table Grape Association. Offering here, if you want to do some research, they're offering $30,000 grant if you can find some health benefit of table grapes. They're not asking an open-ended scientific question. This is find us health benefits that we can use in marketing. I got that letter today. So that's a skewing of the research agenda. So some young person who needs a grant is going to leave it that. I'd love to study whether grapes reduce the risk for coronary heart disease. Good luck with that one. I want to just say nutrition research is really difficult to do because people eat so many different foods and diets vary from day to day, and it's really hard to control for all the variables. And nobody's figured out a way to find out what people eat on a population level. There's no good way to do it. So it's hard, and ADIZ can complain about the failures in nutrition research, but he doesn't come up with any better way to do it. Nobody knows how to do it. But there's no question that the research agenda is skewed. There's just no question about it. Because, and I didn't even go into the partnerships with the USDA, which has marketing orders with an enormous number of food companies, mostly healthy foods, to do research that they can use in marketing. I mean, that's its purpose. And for people who are doing that kind of research, you're not doing basic research. And it's not investigator-driven. It's not, how can we really help the American public or the world or whatever. It's how can we sell table grapes. I like table grapes.
I'm going to ask the last question, but
All
first
right.
say thank you so much for this talk and for, we're very much looking forward to your book.
So am I.
So here's the question. You talked a bunch about trust and mistrust, and I guess, could you talk a little about what you think is at stake? It's trust of nutrition research, but it's also trust of science, of research, of public health. And,
the whole shebang.
Yeah. So what do you think is at stake in this? And, what are your thoughts about how we amplify this discussion?
I think it's really difficult because you're finding a view in society that is amplified by the media, and that it's boring. I'm fond of saying dietary advice is so simple that Michael Pollan can do it in 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Really, that's all there is to it, with some tweakings. But really, that's all there is to it. That's boring. Once you've heard it, you laugh. Everybody laughs. It's boring. It doesn't sell food products. And there's so much investment in selling food products. We've got 4,000 calories per capita available in the United States. For every man, woman, and little tiny baby, it's twice what the population needs. Food companies have to sell food in this environment. It's really hard. So you try to make healthy food more available. You try to get policies that make healthier foods cheaper. You try to convince everybody to stay out of the center aisles of supermarkets, except that supermarkets have figured out that if they put processed foods in the periphery, that people, that takes care of that. You try to get people to eat food. You try to get people cooking again. Good luck with that. You do the best you can you teach kids how to garden and grow food in schools. I think that's the one place where the benefits are so obvious and so dramatic, they make you cry. It's just gorgeous to watch. And those kids will have a different relationship with food as they grow up because of that experience. You do what you can do. And you're fighting society, and the results of all of this in the distrust of science we see everywhere. We see it absolutely everywhere. And science is just another ideology like believing in plant-based diets or some other kind of nutritional thing. Science that's just one way of. I've been told. Science is just one way of looking at the world. It's socially constructed like everything else. To which a physicist friend of mine says, try jumping out the window and see if gravity is socially constructed. We live in a very strange world right now, and whether being focused on these kinds of issues is useful or not, I really don't know. I just felt compelled to do it. And I hope that people will read it. So, when it comes out. Thank you.